All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this informational webinar walking through the new Section 3 final rule. My name is Mackenzie Martin Waldron. I'm the Disaster Recovery Manager on the department's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery team. I'm joined by Michelle Grimes, a housing specialist for Home in the National Housing Trust Fund, and Rebecca Shademan, the department's Consolidated Plan Coordinator. This webinar is scheduled from 10:30 to noon today, and the webinar is being recorded and will be made available after today's presentation on the department's website along with this slide deck. Please feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We plan to save time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. This is intended to be a high-level informational webinar introducing the new Section 3 final rule and the information set forth in the department's Policy Memo 21-01. As we will discuss, HUD has a forthcoming guidebook that will assist subrecipients, contractors, and Section 3 businesses in navigating these Section 3 requirements. NDED is currently developing certification forms, updating our administration manuals, revising monitoring and reporting forms, and preparing trainings in connection with this Section 3 final rule. In the next hour or so, we plan to cover the following: the general purpose and goals of Section 3, an overview of the new rule, including what projects qualify as Section 3, definitional changes, Section 3 requirements, the benchmarks, reporting and record-keeping requirements, then also provide a quick summary of how these requirements differ from the old rule, and then finally, what's next with regard to process updates and considerations. We do want to take a moment and acknowledge a few items. The Section 3 final rule has different triggers and benchmarks for public housing programs than for other types of community development projects. This presentation focuses only on compliance for housing and community development financial assistance. For additional information regarding the differences in treatment of public housing financial assistance, we direct you to 24 CFR Part 75. Additionally, we want to acknowledge the term subrecipient has different meanings under different programs. And for clarity and for purposes of this presentation, the term subrecipient is intended to describe the entity that has an agreement with the department. To get started, we just wanted to address the programs impacted by this Section 3 final rule change. As detailed in the policy memo, the DED programs impacted by this Section 3 final rule change include National Housing Trust Fund, Home ARP, CDBG Coronavirus Funding, and CDBG Disaster Recovery. With the administrative pieces out of the way, we can now examine the purpose of Section 3. As stated on the slide, the purpose of Section 3 is to ensure that economic opportunities, most importantly employment, shall be directed to low and very low income persons, particularly those that are recipients of government assistance for housing or residents of the community where Section 3 covered assistance is expended. Essentially, this gives low-income persons an opportunity to work on HUD projects that are happening in their own backyard. With this in mind, we can look to Section 3's background. Section 3 is authorized by the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. HUD's regulations implementing the requirements of Section 3 had not been updated since 1994. An interim rule had been in effect since 1994 until this final rule was published. This interim rule had regulations set forth in 24 CFR Part 135. However, on April 4th, 2019, HUD proposed a new rule that made updates to Section 3 regulations. The final rule was published on September 29th, 2020, and became effective on November 30th, 2020. The regulations for implementing Section 3 final rule can now be found at 24 CFR Part 75, and these administrative rules establish the requirements to be followed to ensure the objectives of Section 3 are met. As noted on the last slide, the Section 3 final rule directs economic opportunities to low and very low income people who will be served by HUD-funded projects, such as housing and infrastructure. The goal of Section 3 is to go beyond the direct project and create a secondary benefit. This effectively creates a double win in communities that receive HUD funds. The department strives to help Nebraskans achieve an improved quality of life through the development of better communities. HUD's mission strives to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality affordable homes for all. In keeping with these ideals, DED wants to ensure that HUD-funded projects maximize community benefits and economic opportunities for low-income persons and households. This slide summarizes the goals of the updates made to Section 3. As we will discuss today, this update creates more effective incentives for employers to retain and invest in their low and very low-income workers, streamlines reporting requirements by aligning them with typical business practices, provides program-specific oversight, and clarifies the obligations of entities covered by Section 3. These changes will increase Section 3's impact for low and very low-income persons, increase compliance with Section 3 requirements, and reduce the regulatory burden. As noted earlier, the Section 3 final rule became effective on November 30th, 2020. This date is key. Section 3 projects with commitments made before November 30th, 2020 must continue to comply with the previous Section 3 requirements set forth in 24 CFR Part 135. Commitment date is program specific, so we recommend consulting with a DED representative to confirm your project's commitment date to determine which set of rules apply. As a reminder, this presentation is outlining the regulations set forth under the new Section 3 final rule, impacting projects with commitments made on or after November 30th, 2020. The next thing to address is whether the project that you're working on qualifies as a Section 3 project, and therefore if it is subject to compliance with Section 3. Section 3 projects are defined as housing rehabilitation, housing construction, and other public construction document projects that are provided housing and community development financial assistance when that total amount of assistance to the project exceeds a threshold of $200,000. Public construction may include infrastructure work such as extending a water or sewage line, sidewalk repairs, site preparation, and installing conduits for utility services. The $200,000 threshold is inclusive of total HUD assistance provided at the project level and not just the HUD assistance that's overseen by DED. We have an example here just as an illustration that if a project is funded with $101,000 of home funds and $100,000 of CDBG funds, then it exceeds the applicability threshold of $200,000 and therefore will be subject to Section 3 requirements. However, in comparison, if the project is funded with $100,000 of state funds and $100,000 of CDBG funds, it would not qualify as a Section 3 project given the $200,000 threshold. This slide creates a visual of when Section 3 is triggered. Section 3 applicability is dependent upon the type of project and then also the project financing. As discussed on the last slide, Section 3 projects are those that involve housing rehabilitation, housing construction, demolition, or other public construction, and exceed the $200,000 threshold of HUD funds. HUD funds may include HDF, home ARP, CDBG. As you can see, there's a very long list on the screen of the potential HUD funds impacted regarding Section 3. All of these programs are listed here, are also spelled out in a footnote on page 3 of that policy memo 21-01 that the department issued on October 8th. So if we have a Section 3 triggered project, it's also important to dig down more into the project definition. A project is the site or sites together with any buildings and improvements located on the site that are under common ownership, management, and financing. Please note the conjunctive "and" here. There must be common ownership, management, and financing for Section 3 to be triggered. For example, if home funds are used to rehabilitate 20 rental units in one building as part of an effort to rehabilitate 40 units in 2 buildings on a single property, the Section 3 project includes the rehabilitation of all 40 rental units. Section 3 requirements apply to the entire Section 3 project, regardless of whether the project is fully funded or partially funded under HUD programs. Before examining the Section 3 final rule requirements, we think it's important to address a few key revised and new definitions. This will help us all better understand the requirements under Section 3. First, we'll look at Section 3 worker. A Section 3 worker means any worker who currently fits, or when hired in the past 5 years, fit at least one of the following categories. The worker's income for the previous or annualized calendar year is below the income limit established by HUD. The worker is employed by a Section 3 business concern, or the worker is a youth-built participant. There are two key things to note here. The 5-year period for a worker cannot begin before the November 30th, 2020 effective date. Therefore, Section 3 workers hired prior to November 30th, 2020 may be certified for a 5-year period beginning on November 30th, 2020. Additionally, for some background on Youth Build, it is a community-based pre-apprenticeship program that provides job training and educational opportunities for at-risk youth. Next, we can look at Section 3 business concern. A Section 3 business concern means a business concern documented within the last 6-month period to be either at least 51% owned and controlled by low or very low income persons, where greater than 75% of the labor hours performed by the business over the prior 3-month period are performed by Section 3 workers, or at least 51% of the business is owned and controlled by current public housing residents or residents who currently live in Section 8 assisted housing. These definitions are important in examining the employment, training, and contracting requirements for Section 3. The Section 3 final rule also introduces a new definition of targeted Section 3 worker. A targeted Section 3 worker is a Section 3 worker who is employed by a Section 3 business concern, or a worker who currently fits or when hired fit at least one of the following categories as documented again within the last 5 years, either living in the service area or neighborhood of the project. This will be addressed on the next slide and how to define that service area and neighborhood, or is a youth-built participant. As you can see on this slide, targeted Section 3 workers are a focused subset of Section 3 workers, and that's important to consider as we continue through the requirements and benchmarks set forth by HUD. Finally, we'll discuss that a service area or neighborhood of the project is now defined as an area within 1 mile of the Section 3 project, or if there are less than 5,000 people within that 1 mile of the Section 3 project, within a circle centered on that Section 3 project that is sufficient to encompass a population of 5,000 people according to the most recent census. The graphic on this slide is attempting to illustrate that definition. We can imagine that the gray circle is the area within 1 mile of the project and that it has a population of 1,000 people. Because there is less than 5,000 people within this 1 mile radius of the work site, we must expand the circle around the project till it encompasses 5,000 people. In this example, it is expanded 50 miles to encapsulate a population of 5,000 people. And HUD is working currently on an online tool to help assist in navigating and identifying these service areas, so additional information is forthcoming there. With these definitions in mind, we can look at the Section 3 requirements related to employment, training, and contracts. First, related to employment and training, to the greatest extent feasible and consistent with existing federal, state, and local laws and regulations, subrecipients are to ensure that employment and training opportunities in connection with Section 3 projects are provided to Section 3 workers within the metropolitan area where the project is located or the non-metropolitan county. Additionally, where feasible, priorities for these opportunities and training should be given to Section 3 workers that reside in that service area and neighborhood that we just discussed, and to those that are participants in youth build programs. Looking at the contracting side, similarly to the greatest extent feasible and consistent with federal, state, and local laws and regulations, subrecipients are to ensure that contracts for work awarded in connection with Section 3 projects are provided to business concerns that provide economic opportunities to Section 3 workers residing within the metropolitan area or the non-metropolitan county where the project is located. Additionally, where feasible, priority for contracting opportunities should again be given to Section 3 businesses that provide economic opportunities to Section 3 workers living in that service area or neighborhood of the project and youth build programs. With these requirements in mind, we can now examine the expectations and benchmarks from HUD that they've set forth in their most recent guidance. HUD has established Section 3 benchmarks for the number of hours that Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers work on a project. The Section 3 benchmarks are minimum targets that must be reached for the subrecipient to be considered in compliance with Section 3 requirements. These benchmarks are updated every 3 years by HUD via Federal Register notice. The benchmarks for Section 3 workers is currently set at 25% or more of the total labor hours for an assisted project each year. This is calculated by dividing the total number of hours worked by Section 3 workers by the total number of hours worked by all workers on the project in a subrecipient's program year. Looking more focused at the targeted Section 3 workers, the benchmark for targeted Section 3 workers is currently 5% or more of the total labor hours for assisted project each year. This is calculated by dividing the number of labor hours worked by targeted Section 3 workers by the total number of labor hours worked by all workers on a Section 3 project in the subrecipient's program year. This means that the 5% applicable to targeted Section 3 workers is included as a part of the larger 25% threshold required for all Section 3 workers. And then meeting these outcome benchmarks of 25% and 5% provides recipients a safe harbor where HUD presumes that the recipient is complying with all Section 3 requirements. It's also important to note that these Section 3 requirements don't apply to material-only contracts or those contracts that don't require any labor. In those instances, Section 3 is encouraged but not required. And finally, we'll discuss professional service contracts. Professional service contracts for non-construction services that require an advanced degree or professional licensing are not required to be reported in connection with Section 3 labor hours. However, we'll discuss later an opportunity for subrecipients to receive a bonus if they're able to report Section 3 labor hours in the professional services context. With all that in mind, it's helpful to walk through an example. This example is further detailed in the Section 3 Final Rule Policy Memo that the department released on October 8th. DED awards the City of Anytown $300,000 of CDBG funds for street improvements. Because the total amount of assistance to that project exceeds the threshold of $200,000, the Section 3 requirements apply to this project. DED must require the City of Anytown to report the following accomplishments to DED within the applicable reporting cycles. Anytown will report the total labor hours worked, the total labor hours worked by Section 3 workers, and the total labor hours worked by targeted Section 3 workers on the Section 3 project. The City of Anytown is responsible for reporting labor hour data related to these street improvements. And during the first reporting period, the City of Anytown reports that they had a total of 5,000 labor hours worked on the project. Of those 5,000 hours, 1,300 were worked by employees who have self-certified as Section 3 workers, and additionally 300 of those 1,300 hours were performed by workers who live within a 1-mile radius of the worksite. Therefore, they qualify as targeted Section 3 workers. Based on this information, the City of Anytown has met the project level Section 3 benchmarks and can report the following data set forth in the table in the next reporting cycle. As you can see, they report that 26% of all hours are reported as Section 3 labor hours, and 6% are targeted Section 3 hours. We can look at the math behind this now. If we divide the 1,300 labor hours worked by Section 3 workers by the total of 5,000 labor hours worked on the project, we get that 26%. This exceeds the 25% benchmark set forth by HUD. Similarly, 300 of those 1,300 hours are worked by targeted Section 3 workers. If we divide the 300 hours worked by the targeted Section 3 workers by the 5,000 total labor hours, we get 6%, and this exceeds the 5% benchmark set forth by HUD. If these benchmarks are met, subrecipients fall under the safe harbor and are considered to be in compliance with Section 3 requirements, absent any evidence to the contrary. Next, we can look at the best efforts in attempts to comply with these Section 3 benchmarks. Subrecipients are required to make best efforts, or to the greatest extent feasible, to achieve those benchmarks required by the number of labor hours to be performed by both Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers. Similarly, subrecipients have to adequately document the qualitative efforts taken to meet these numerical goals. Here we're walking through a few examples of best efforts that demonstrate a commitment to comply with Section 3. For example, you can engage in outreach efforts to generate job applicants who are targeted Section 3 workers. This may be done by hosting one or more job fairs, providing training or apprenticeship opportunities. You could provide direct assistance to Section 3 workers via helping those seek and compete for jobs through resume assistance, coaching, interview prep, and job placement. For work readiness and retention, that could be through work readiness activities, interview clothing, test fees, transportation, and childcare. To apply for or to attend community college, a four-year educational institution, or a vocational or technical training through scholarships, test prep and fees, and application support, or assist in obtaining financial literacy training or coaching. We have some additional best efforts continued on this next slide to provide direct support to Section 3 businesses. This could be through identifying and securing bids from Section 3 business concerns, or helping them understand and bid on contracts. You can also encourage Section 3 business participation by dividing contracts into smaller jobs to facilitate participation by Section 3 business concerns, by providing bonding assistance, guarantees, or other efforts to support viable bids to Section 3 business concerns, and promoting the use of business registries designed to create these opportunities for disadvantaged and small businesses. With these best efforts in mind, it is important to document any and all actions taken to comply with these requirements of Section 3. If you do not document the action taken, it's difficult to conclude that it ever happened. So be careful to capture all actions taken to comply. Documenting who, what, when, why, and how is helpful when capturing details of qualitative efforts. It's important to identify dates, events, and any communications either in print or via email. With that in mind, we thought it would be helpful to point to a few of HUD's resources intended to assist subrecipients in meeting their Section 3 benchmarks. The HUD Opportunity Portal may be used by Section 3 workers, targeted Section 3 workers, or employers to help identify jobs and training and contracting opportunities. Similarly, HUD's Section 3 Business Registry is a listing of firms that have self-certified that they meet one of the regulatory definitions of a Section 3 business. And those are included in a searchable online database that can be used by agencies receiving HUD funds, by developers, or by contractors. It can also be handy to be used by Section 3 workers to identify businesses that may have HUD-funded employment opportunities. And the Opportunity Portal and the Business Registry resources may be helpful in meeting these Section 3 benchmarks or in demonstrating the qualitative efforts taken to meet these benchmarks. As we've seen so far, Section 3 requires tracking and reporting of labor hours. The labor hours must be tracked for all persons working on a Section 3 project. The reporting of these labor hours must be submitted to DED as described within your subrecipient agreement between the subrecipient and DED, or in any associated manuals or instructional guidance issued by the department. And then in collecting this information surrounding Section 3, the information to be submitted includes the total number of labor hours worked by subrecipients, contractors, and subcontractors. This will include the total number of labor hours worked. That was the denominator in that calculation that we did previously. And the total number of labor hours worked by Section 3 workers, and the total number of labor hours worked by targeted Section 3 workers. Subrecipients must make all entities that they contract with aware of the need to comply with Section 3, so it's important to notify and work with contractors and subcontractors in that regard. We mentioned previously the context of professional service hours. Specifically, professional service hours are excluded from the reporting requirement for Section 3 and targeted Section 3 workers. This is because it's very difficult to recruit and hire eligible persons for these roles due to the higher wages and salaries earned for these types of jobs. Subrecipients should not include the labor hours worked for professional services in the total labor hours worked on a project. Again, that's the denominator of the calculation. However, if employees in the professional services role can meet the definition of a Section 3 worker or a targeted Section 3 worker, subrecipients can report the labor hours in the applicable worker hour category. That would be in the numerator of that calculation. The effect of this reporting structure is to give a recipient a bonus if they're able to report Section 3 labor hours in a professional services context. And then with all of that in mind, subrecipients must also adequately document those qualitative efforts taken to meet the numerical goals and convey those goals to DED throughout the reporting process. And then on to record-keeping requirements. Documentation must be retained by the subrecipient to ensure that workers meet a definition for Section 3 worker or a targeted Section 3 worker. As set forth on the screen, there's a list of documentation that's possible to demonstrate that you are a Section 3 worker or that you are a targeted Section 3 worker. For Section 3 workers, this documentation may include a worker's self-certification that their income is below the income limit from the prior calendar year, the worker's self-certification of participation in a means-tested program, such as public housing or Section 8 assisted housing, certification from a public housing agency or the owner or property manager of a project-based Section 8 assisted housing, or the administrator of a tenant-based Section 8 assisted housing that the worker is a participant in one of their programs, an employer's certification of the worker's income, or the employer's certification that the worker is employed by a Section 3 business concern. For targeted Section 3 workers, this documentation may include the employer's confirmation that a worker's residence is within 1 mile of the work site, similar to that service area or neighborhood, the expansion to 5,000 people. If there's not 5,000 people in that 1 mile of the work site, we're expanding that to encompass 5,000 people. It could be employer certification that the worker is employed by a Section 3 business concern, or the worker's self-certification that the worker is a youth-built participant. It's important to note that a subrecipient may report on Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers for 5 years from when their certification as a Section 3 worker or targeted Section 3 worker is established. And then to wrap up the introduction of this Section 3 final rule, we thought it might be helpful to outline a brief summary of the changes from the previous interim rule for those of you with familiarity of the previous rule, and compare that to the changes now that are impacted by the new rule. First, the interim rule, that Part 135, looked at measuring hiring and contracting. As we've discussed today, this new rule measures labor hours. Second, the interim rule sought to have 30% of those new hires be Section 3 residents. As we've discussed today, the final rule establishes that 25% of the total project hours must be worked by Section 3 workers. Unlike the interim rule, the final rule also creates that category of targeted Section 3 workers that we discussed today and establishes a separate benchmark, that 5%, to be achieved by this subset of workers. Unlike the interim rule, subcontracting to Section 3 businesses no longer qualifies a business as Section 3, but now subcontractors, their contractors, and subrecipients all of those hours are counted and included to meet those Section 3 benchmarks. Unlike the interim rule, businesses can qualify as Section 3 businesses if they are at least 51% owned and controlled by current public housing residents or residents who currently live in Section 8 assisted housing. And this is in addition to those other ways that we listed in order to qualify as a Section 3 business concern. There are no longer monetary benchmarks for contracting to Section 3 firms. As we've talked about today, it's instead a percentage of the total labor hours worked on a project. And additionally, the professional service hours that we talked about are not subject to Section 3, but can provide a bonus now. Finally, these outcome benchmarks are no longer fixed. HUD will be reevaluating these 25% and 5% benchmarks every 3 years and may provide an update via Federal Register notice. Next, we're going to look at the process updates and considerations and what this looks like at HUD's level, at the DED level, and at the subrecipient level.
So the HUD is currently developing additional resources intended to help subrecipients, contractors, and Section 3 businesses who manage and implement the Section 3 provisions. DED's actions. DED is currently developing certification forms, updating administration manuals, revising monitoring and reporting forms, and preparing trainings in connection with the Section 3 final rule. Next slide. Subrecipient actions. So subrecipients should be proactive in updating Section 3 related processes and procedure and communicating expectations related to the Section 3 final rule. Assess your current active agreements with DED to determine which set of Section 3 rules apply. Take inventory of solicitation packages, templates, and other relevant documents to update Section 3 applicable language. Relay Section 3 final rule changes to contractors or prospective proposers and ensure contractor understanding of Section 3 reporting. Communicate clear record-keeping duties to contractors and continue to outreach efforts after winning bidder proposal is awarded. Next slide. So Section 3 resources, Mackenzie had mentioned earlier, there's a HUD Exchange portal just for Section 3. And there's also a Section 3 HUD frequently asked questions that are out there and that's updated. The HUD income limits, there's a link here on the slide, and then also Section 3, the Federal Register notices, there's a link to each one of those notices. Next slide. So now we're at questions and answers. Rebecca, do we have any questions?
No, I have not received any questions, but I know that some of our users may have not been able to see the Q&A function. If you're one of those users, if you click the three little dots at the lower bottom right-hand corner, there should be a Q&A section. I've also turned the chat back on if anyone does have questions on that. And we'll just take a moment. One thing I would like to add with this, because I know this is all very new information, if Mackenzie, if you could go back to slide 11, I think you said it was. Just want to reiterate what Mackenzie said is really when Section 3 gets impacted here is with any buildings and improvements located on the sites that are under common ownership, management, and financing. So that is a key phrase right there. So if you are taking a look at your projects, definitely keep that in mind and always consult with your DED representative to see if you are understanding the Section 3 regulations correctly. I have not received any questions yet. Mackenzie or Michelle, is there anything you guys want to reiterate just as information?
I would just like to just mention again that we will be updating our manuals, forms, contracts, and we'll be contacting any projects that are affected by this rule on the home and HDF side, and I'm sure CDBG will be doing the same, and working with each one of you on making sure you're following the new rule.
I did receive a question from the group. If you have a housing rehab project that impacts 10 separate homes at a proposed cost of $25,000 per home, that comes to $250,000 plus administration costs. Does this apply in this case or not? And the key thing to look at this is, I'm guessing your housing rehab example here are separate homes. They have different owners. So they would, it's not under common ownership. So you would not meet that definition there. Michelle, anything else you want to add, or Mackenzie?
I'm good.
Okay. We do have another question. If we are constructing 3 houses on scatter sites that are for a total grant of $500,000, are we required to follow Section 3? I would take a look at who is the common ownership for that question for those 3 houses. If you are owning all of the scattered sites as one entity, you could be triggering Section 3, but please consult with your DED program rep to make sure we are under the common understanding of if you are triggering Section 3. And then Mackenzie, if you want to go back to the slide of next action steps. So please take a look at all of your active agreements in place right now to see when they were executed, and also take a look at the program rules of how commitment is defined. That will be a key item. So if anything around November 30th, please reach out to us to see if this triggers the Section 3 rule. We are taking a look at all the contracts that have been executed between us and our subrecipients, but we also want our subrecipients to do the exact same thing to make sure that you have a good comprehension of the regulations that apply to your program. So, and I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. If you have more questions coming that come to you after this presentation, please reach out to us. We are, Mackenzie, Michelle, and I have all been diving in pretty deep with Section 3. So please send us an email so we can take a look at how this impacts your specific projects. And then we did receive a question, thank you. Will the future applications for grants include these requirements? Mackenzie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, definitely. So just to repeat, the question was, will future applications for grants include these requirements? So that is the regulation has been issued by HUD to discuss any awarded projects that are kind of that housing rehabilitation, housing construction, and public construction, those infrastructure projects. So if it's the project type that qualifies, as well as the $200,000 threshold, if we meet both of those requirements, that relates to a Section 3 triggered project. And that would be on the award side after an application would be awarded. Please feel free to follow up if that did not fully answer your question.
We did have a question received asking if this does include the Nebraska Affordable Housing Trust Funds, and this does not include the Nebraska Affordable Housing Trust Funds. It only impacts these programs. However, we did have an example. If you have, I believe, we'll say 200,000 in National Housing Trust Funds, and that is paired with a Nebraska Affordable Housing Trust Funds, then Section 3 would be triggered. Correct, Mackenzie?
So the example that we talked about earlier related to if we have $100,000 of, it could be home funds, CDBG funds, and $100,000 of separate state funds, that would not be a Section 3 project. That was the example we walked through earlier. Rebecca, are you speaking to a different example? I just want to make sure I'm not answering a different question.
The same example, however, if they trigger it with, let's say they have $201,000 of home funds and then $100,000 of Nebraska Affordable Housing Trust Funds in the same project, would that trigger Section 3?
Yeah, Rebecca, you stated that there would be $201,000 of home funds. And would exceed if we're meeting the definition of the Section 3 project of the housing rehabilitation, housing construction, and we meet that special definition of project where we talked about common ownership, management, and whatnot, Plus, we have met that $200,000 threshold, and it states in that example we have $201,000 of home funds. And you are correct. Section 3 would apply in that situation. Again, if you have any specific situations that are specific to unique circumstances, we highly recommend and ask that you reach out to the DED representative just to confirm that we know all of the finer details of the question that you have. But with that in mind, then once Section 3 applies, it applies to all of the funds that are involved in that project.
So definitely take a look at all the financing going into a project. If you have projects that have those federal funds and they're meeting that threshold, please take a look at how everything's interlaced with the financing. I know we do a lot of layering with our financing on some of our projects. And Michelle, we got another question. I'm not sure if you saw it in the chat. Would you be able to answer that one?
Yes. When you indicated this applies to housing rehabilitation, but then said not OOR, would you give an example of a housing rehabilitation project to which this applies? So I would say my understanding would be that if you have an owner-occupied rehab where you have different owners and you're rehabbing those projects, as long as you don't trigger the $201,000 per owner per property. And then if you're doing, I would use an example as a purchase rehab resale project where the developer owns all the properties. My understanding, it would trigger because it is still owned under the developer. Is that a good enough example, Mackenzie?
Yeah, I think that covered it.
Okay.
Okay, we do have a couple more questions in the chat. When do you anticipate to have guidance documents available for entities to utilize? We are currently working on those, and we're also taking a look at what HUD is making available. They've been releasing information periodically as they have information available. So if you want to keep as up to date as we are with the state, I definitely recommend going on to the HUD exchange and signing up for the Section 3 listserv. You would get notifications at the same time as we would be getting notifications and taking a look at those. But we know that this is a priority and we are working on it, but we don't have a solid timeline to give you at this point. And then we did receive another question, and I'm not sure if we have the answer to this one, but I'll say it out loud to all the panelists here. Is this triggered by grant award or by individual projects? For example, the purchase rehab resale program might be awarded over $250,000, but it might be 10 individual projects. Mackenzie or Michelle, I know we're still doing some research on this. Have you guys dived into that? Otherwise, we'll go ahead.
Sorry. So my understanding, it depends on the owner and it goes by project as an overall project. In my training, I wasn't able to sit on the first training that was out there from HUD. So my training is in 2 weeks. And we will update frequently asked questions that we had put out. Is that right, Rebecca? That
Correct.
We released with our memo. So as we learn things, and we will make sure that those get updated and sent out to the listserv.
And the 21-01 policy memo that was released earlier this month contains all of the most recent HUD guidance with respect to the information set forth in the Federal Register notices, their specific CPD notices, and all of the resources that were made available prior to October 8th on the HUD exchange. So that's kind of the information that we had available to be able to summarize and put into a more readable document with everything in one place. As Michelle and Rebecca indicated, as more information becomes available, be as transparent as possible in conveying the requirements and additional explanation as we receive it.
We did receive one more question, and I'm not sure if we have the answer to it. So Mackenzie, I'm going to pose this to you. What are the ramifications if, in spite of best efforts, a subrecipient does not meet the thresholds and doesn't fall under the safe harbor?
So kind of if you're not able to meet the 25% and 5% benchmarks, that's why we're doing those qualitative efforts and documenting everything that has been done. The statute is qualified to the greatest extent feasible. So of course, there are definitely circumstances where even despite best efforts, the benchmarks aren't going to be achievable or you're not able to meet them. So the important thing there is that document. Any efforts taken to comply with Section 3. Again, it's to the greatest extent feasible. So as long as you can demonstrate those qualitative efforts of trying to comply and seeing what you can do to try to meet the expectations of Section 3 would be the best thing to do.
And HUD does provide some examples of what best efforts look like. Mackenzie, if you scroll to those, I forget what slide it's on. These are some examples that HUD provided when they released their CPD memo on Section 3. And so if we are not able to meet the 25% and the 5% percentages requirements, then we have to identify which one of these efforts were taken to further Section 3. So this would be one of the questions we would be asking our subrecipients if they did any of these best efforts to try to reach the Section 3 goal. So again, document. It's this slide and then also the next slide that provide them. So well, I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in. If you do think of a question, please email Michelle, Mackenzie, and I. Any questions that you have regarding Section 3. We will be taking a look at all questions received and then be updating our FAQ on our webpage to make sure that we can answer that. We'll notify you guys once that is updated. We want to make sure everyone has as much information as possible regarding this new regulation. Thank you for joining us.